much larger figures, purposefully larger, arrayed between these triangles. Some are Hebrew prophets, Old Testament prophets like Isaiah or Joel here. But the other half of them aren't Judeo-Christian. They're pagan. They're Greco-Roman oracles, like the Delphic oracle, the oracle at Delphi, where if you were living in classical Athens, you had a question about the future, you'd go see the oracle at Delphi. And she would take some type of drug and tell you some weird riddle that you would then make sense of. Here's the Erythraean sibyl. And so prophets and sibyls, both of whom, it's argued in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, foretold in some way or another the coming of Jesus. And so they're up here on the ceiling too. So we go back to the schematic then. We've gone over a lot of the ceiling, but there are other figures up there that don't get a lot of press. There is, for example, David and Goliath, and Judith and Holofernes. Both Old Testament stories that we've seen deployed by people like the Medici through Donatello for their own ends. But this is Michelangelo's take on these two topics. Here is David. There's his sling. But this is not a calm David that he had sculpted in Florence, almost a contemplative David. This is a David ready to cut Goliath's head off. He's got his scimitar there. He's ready to swing. Not unlike, the pose of Judith. Donatello's Judith, who's got the scimitar up, ready to cut his head off. He's straddling Goliath, just as Judith is straddling Holofernes, ready to deliver the killer blow. And then his treatment of Judith is much more traditional. Generally speaking, as we learned from the article about those two Donatello bronzes, that Judith was usually displayed ex post facto. The head's already gone. It's right there. It's a giant head, by the way. And Judith and her maid are carrying it out of the Assyrians' tent. A more traditional interpretation or depiction of this, these two biblical stories here. So then, we saw bronze Donatello and a bronze Judith, commissioned by Cosimo. One stood in the courtyard, the David, the Judith and Holofernes in the center of their garden, which was connected to the courtyard, also kind of a public space as well. And these two statues were used by the Medici family to bolster their Republican credentials at a time when they are actively subverting the Republican government and business is taking place at their palace instead of the Palazzo dei Priori. And then here, in a very different space, same figures, same stories, with a very different meaning. This shows us the extent to which the interpretation of art is really dependent upon its context. The Michelangelo David put in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, the Palazzo dei Priori, after the expulsion of the Medici, is a very Republican symbol. Put in the courtyard of the Medici, it's a Medici symbol. The same is true for Judith and Holofernes here. Art can be interpreted many different ways depending on the patron on the one hand and its placement, its context on the other. So, last thing I've got for today is the restoration project, which was carried out on the ceiling, again, over a 20-year period. 1979, the same year that work starts, the controversial work starts on the Last Supper, on Il Cenacolo. In Milan, work begins here in Rome to restore the ceiling. And this was at least as controversial, if not even more so, than the cleaning of the Last Supper and the restoration of the Last Supper, because this is more important. This is a massive part of the Italian identity. And what they did was, they stripped away a layer of varnish that was on the ceiling. The argument being that this varnish was not put up there, but rather it was a kind of effect of candles, effect of all the burning of stuff that happened in this chapel. And so the result was a lot brighter colors. A lot brighter colors. Now, critics said that this was not what Michelangelo had intended, that this was a Benetton version of Michelangelo, a reference to the clothing company, that he would be horrified if he saw the light mauve/pink robe of God, that was not what he intended, that the cleaning went too far. Now, my own opinion, I'm not an art historian. I don't know really the ins and outs of this very contentious debate, but I think it was a good thing. And I think now, 10 years on, most people in Italy are happy with the result, but certainly the process itself, very, very contentious. A lot of arguments had over what did Michelangelo intend. Did he want it to be muted, or did he want these bright colors? Well, if we look at a side-by-side, this is an old picture, and that's a new picture. I think they did the right thing. And I think future generations will be happy for the work that was done, because it was becoming not unrecognizable, but it's a completely different experience now. It's a much more powerful experience. It's a much more vibrant experience. And you know, maybe that's not exactly what he intended, but you know what? He died half a millennium ago. We can't ask him, and he didn't leave any notes, so what are we going to do? I'm glad they did it, as I'm glad they cleaned up the Cenacolo of the Last Supper, because had they not done that, it would eventually get to a point that, well, who knows? Who knows what would have happened? So, the massive restoration project. So, what have we learned here? Well, we started off with a young Michelangelo, 13-year-old. 13 years old. Bogglingly young. When I was 13, I was in no position to be enrolled in Lorenzo de' Medici's Art Academy, already creating works that bordered on masterpieces. And at the tender age of 23, 1498, he flees to Rome, because in that year, his patrons, his adopted family, the Medici, are expelled. And because he had lived with them, because he was so closely associated with them, he decided that it would be good if he left town too. And so he goes to Rome for a little while. While there, he's commissioned by a cardinal, a French cardinal actually, to create this vision of the Pietà, of the dead Christ with the Virgin Mary, which he does very impressively. And already when he's finished with the Pietà, he's widely regarded to be the greatest sculptor ever, and he's just getting started. But he's recognized from a really young age to be something special, which probably didn't help his ego. Think of like star athletes. When they get smoke blowing up their you-know-what from a young age, sometimes, not always, they don't turn out that good, and there are problems. They lose sight of reality. I don't think that necessarily happened to Michelangelo, but he certainly had an ego. A tremendous ego. And you know what? He backs it up. It's a man who didn't know how to paint in 1508, had to hire a couple of Florentine lackeys to teach him how to fresco, and then proceeded to create the greatest painted work of art in probably human history. That's not bad.